So why is DDR5 so expensive? I don't know. Maybe it's just because it's newer, better technology, which it fundamentally is, kind of irrelevant of any of the performance differences that might or might not be there. This is fundamentally better memory. Or maybe it's because of this beast, and I'm not exaggerating, this weighs a ton. Yeah. How cool is that? Completely irrelevant, and yes, I'm sure you're not going to get this with the kit that you buy off Overclockers or wherever you buy it from, but yeah, this is pretty cool. And I'm going to add here, yes, this is not sponsored by Corsair in any way. This was just something that they sent us with our sample, which I had to give some airtime because this is one of the best novelty items that I think I've ever received. Really cool. Maybe I will do some chopping with it at some point. What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and Intel has just launched its new 12th gen Alder Lake platform, and it brings with it, especially on the Z690 platform, a host of new technologies, some of which are really exciting. And I think the key exciting technology that it ushers into the 2021 market is DDR5. So this is the first new standard for desktop memory since DDR4 made an appearance back in 2014. Yes, it's been that long. With promised boosts in frequency versus DDR4, higher density modules enabling greater capacities, and reduced power consumption, DDR5 looks like a stellar improvement. But with 12th gen Alder Lake chips supporting both DDR4 and DDR5, motherboard dependent of course, we have an ideal opportunity to test the new memory technology versus the incumbent on a like-for-like basis, and that's pretty exciting. Just how good is a brand new premium set of DDR5 memory like this Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB that we have? How does it fare against a variety of DDR4 offerings? And is it worth the sizable price jump of around 280 to 300 plus pounds for a 32GB kit of DDR5 versus somewhere in the order of 160 to maybe 230 or 240 for a pretty premium kit of DDR4 memory? If you like what we do here at Kit Guru, make sure you give us a like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon, you can do all that YouTube stuff to really support us, and make sure you check out the written page on the Kit Guru website. DDR5 has several notable improvements versus DDR4, namely frequency of course, but as a genius piece of marketing from Crucial tells us, DDR5, not just faster, better. Yeah, I'm sure someone got a nice fat bonus paycheck for that. But in all seriousness, let's have a look at the clocks. As we would expect, one of the core changes is frequency. So back in the days of 2014 when DDR4 was brand new onto the market, you typically see modules in the order of 2400 MHz, 2666 MHz, or if you were really fancy, you could probably get 3200, but it was a headache with that old X99 platform. Now, of course, you can get 4 GHz plus DDR4 modules via overclocking, and that's pretty commonplace. DDR5 actually increases the frequency to about 4800 MHz on the nominal side of things, and from day one we'll see premium kits run at 5200 MHz and higher. So that's a sizable gain in frequency for DDR5 versus DDR4. That's a big boost in frequency for DDR5, but it does come with a significant loosening of the timings. Our 5200 MHz Corsair kit, for example, runs at 36, 38, 38. Yeah, that's pretty loose indeed. Whereas a comparable DDR4 memory kit running at, a decent 3600 MHz frequency would probably be something like 16, 18, 18, maybe 18, 19, 19, or some of the lower end stuff is 18, 22, 22. Or if you've got really deep pockets, you can get an Uber kit like we saw from Kingston recently at 53, 33 MHz, and that was actually C20, albeit 1.6 volts. So clearly the timings are a lot tighter on DDR4. Thus far we've got a big speed boost, worse latencies, but we also have to introduce better power management for DDR5. You get a change to voltage control via a Power Management Integrated Circuit, or PMIC. This essentially allows the DDR5 module to handle power management and reduces that burden on the motherboard control. Nominal DDR5 voltage is 1.1 volts versus 1.2 volts for DDR4, but as we saw with DDR4, common XMP voltages were 1.35 volts and sometimes as high as 1.45 volts, whereas nominal XMP voltage for DDR5 is typically going to be 1.25 volts to start with. Speaking of XMP, DDR5 ushers in XMP 3.0. This enables greater tuning by increasing the number of slots to 5. This can mean 3 profiles for manufacturer settings, as well as 2 slots for users to save custom profiles. That's cool, especially as you can save custom profiles with names to something like Corsair IQ, if you have a really fancy overclock that you want to keep. And then aside from the changes to clocks, latencies, power management, XMP 3.0, there are some significant under-the-hood tweaks. The way in which the sub-channels are now split is 2x32-bit instead of 1x64-bit. The notch position has changed for DDR5 versus DDR4, and this is good. It prevents an incorrect installation, clearly. There's on-die ECC, and you get double the banks and double the burst lengths versus DDR4. Basically, there are indeed quite a few changes beyond the headline specification to the under-the-hood operating for DDR5. Of course, there's plenty of information on these changes from various sources, including the memory manufacturers themselves. So instead of butchering and plagiarizing their work, I would encourage you to go and read their websites and Wikipedia if you prefer. So now that the core look at DDR5 is out of the way, let's jump into the testing configuration. For testing, our core hardware is based around the new Intel Core i9-12900K processor at stock frequencies with XMP enabled. If you want more details on this process, then make sure you check out Leo's written review and his video review, which should give you a good overview of the chip. For cooling, we've got a 280mm Acertec based liquid cooler. The motherboard's an Asus ROG Strix Z690 DDR5, and we've got an Asus TUF Gaming based Z690 DDR4. Frame pushing power comes from a Gigabyte RTX 3080 Eagle OC graphics card. We use a Corsair MP600 1TB PCIe Gen 4 SSD. And clean power is delivered from a couple of 1 kilowatt plus PSUs, namely the Seasonic TX1000, which is an absolute beast. As always, if you want more details on the test system and the hardware that we used and the comparison data, head on over to the written page on the Kit Guru website. Now focusing on the memory kits that we're testing, for DDR5 we have our sole contender here because even samples are still quite limited, pre-release to be honest, and this is Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB. So this is a 2x16GB DDR5 kit run 5200 MHz frequency with timings of 36, 38, 38 at 1.25 volts XMP. The memory ICs are Micron A spec in a single rank configuration, and that's important because 16GB DIMMs for DDR5 are typically going to be single rank because of the higher density ICs used under the hood, whereas 16GB DIMMs on DDR4 were very often dual rank. So depending on your platform, the rank interleave in there could have some benefits or some downsides for DDR4 versus DDR5. As we already know, the AMD platform is particularly sensitive and preferential toward dual rank memory, but we'll have to see if this single rank DDR5 can keep pace with dual rank DDR4 on the Intel platform. That'll be interesting to see. Of course, these sticks support XMP 3.0, and you get all the usual Corsair bells and whistles of a fantastic RGB LED system built around Capellix, of course, and then a good thermal sensor because these are premium Dominator modules that weigh a ton and look fantastic. And pricing for this kit looks to be around about £330 on overclockers, so as we've already said, quite the hefty price premium for DDR5. Our DDR5 motherboard is the Asus ROG Strix Z690F Gaming, using the BIOS revision dated late August 2021, as that's the most recent that we could get our hands on. The motherboard that we chose to make this like-for-like testing possible is the Asus TUF Gaming Z690 Plus Wi-Fi D4. Absolute mouthful, what a terrible name, but it looks like a competent motherboard, and that D4 signals that it supports DDR4 memory, even though it's a 12th gen LGA 1700 Z690 platform motherboard. The BIOS revision here is actually newer than the Strix offering, unfortunately, so that is one thing to bear in mind. So this is dated late October 2021, as we were able to get a newer BIOS revision from Asus, whereas obviously the Strix board is a bit older. So yeah, just bear that in mind. For our DDR4 comparison test kits, we try to grab a reasonable range of frequencies and timings on the sets, and we also try to look at a varied configuration of dual rank, some single rank, and some 4-stick single rank also. So hopefully this will give us some variety of test data to look at. We have a Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro SL kit representing a budget 32GB option. This is 3600 MHz 182222 at 1.35 volts XMP, and it uses 2x16GB DIMMs but using single rank Micron B-die ICs. We have a G-Skill Trident Z Royal Elite kit representing a premium 32GB option. This is 3600 MHz 141414 at 1.45 volts XMP, and it's 2x16GB dual rank using Samsung B-die ICs. We've got a mid-range type high-speed offering at 32GB using Clev sticks. This is 4000 MHz 192525 at 1.4 volts XMP, and this uses 8GB single rank modules but in a 4-stick configuration using Hynix DJR ICs. And then we also have a Kingston Fury Renegade kit representing an uber premium ludicrous 16GB set with DDR5 type speeds but actually being DDR4. This is 5333 MHz C20 at 1.6 volts XMP, but our motherboard didn't like that speed, as with most boards that we've tested, so we had to settle for 4400 MHz 192323, which is still very nice. This is 2x8GB using single rank modules and Hynix DJR ICs. It must be noted that, as we saw with the 11th gen chips, the 12th gen Intel chips have a gear ratio for their memory controller clock speed. Basically, this allows you to rank down, in essence, the memory controller on the CPU so that you can run higher DRAM clocks. So we noticed in our testing, at 3600 MHz you'd run 1 for 1, so the DRAM clock would obviously be 1800 MHz and the memory controller clock would be 1800 MHz in that gear 1. But when we were putting in the 4000 MHz and above kits, that would change to gear 2. So we were getting a 2-to-1 ratio. So effectively at 4 GHz memory, you'd get a 2 GHz DRAM clock, and then your 2-to-1 ratio would give you a 1 GHz memory controller clock. Could this be a significant factor that really does penalize DDR5? Or is it going to be a non-issue on the Intel platform? Let's have a look. And as always, if you want more details on the configuration, the specs, the testing, etc., head on over to the Kit Guru website. In terms of memory bandwidth, DDR5 is a massive improvement over even highly clocked and dual rank DDR4 kits. This comes as zero surprise to basically everybody, but it is good to visualize in chart form just how significant the bandwidth increase versus common spec DDR4 is. Of course, the downside of DDR5 shows up pretty quickly: latency. Timings numbers in the high 30s will never result in a good latency score. Add in the reduced memory controller frequency and the latency performance for DDR5 is not strong. It will be interesting to see how this is shown in real-world tests. With 7-zip compression performance, we see the Corsair DDR5 5200 MHz kit put in an absolutely storming result. The far greater frequency provided by DDR5 translates into higher bandwidth, and this in turn is a bigger influence in the compression workload than any latency negativities. Aside from DDR5, the next contenders are either dual rank or 4 single rank DIMMs on DDR4. The decompression workload is less influenced by memory bandwidth. As such, the margins of performance between each kit are squeezed. Here, a quick set of dual rank DDR4 with strong timings is likely to match or surpass the performance of DDR5 5200 MHz modules. Blender's classroom test shows an identical hierarchy to the 7-zip decompression workload. The margins are tight, but the ultra-high spec DDR4 kits are able to match or slightly outperform the 5200 MHz Dominator Platinum RGB DDR5. Differences in Cinebench performance are minor, so much so that we would not really call the difference in performance between the top DDR4 and DDR5 sets anything worth pointing out. Handbrake clearly likes memory bandwidth and therefore rewards the DDR5 memory with a high score. Here, the Dominator Platinum RGB DDR5 is tangibly quicker than even the ultra high-end DDR4 comparisons. This extra bandwidth delivered by DDR5 could be useful if you do a lot of heavy video conversion work. 3DMark's CPU profile max threads test puts the DDR5 configuration top of our chart, but the differences in performance between all memory setups are small enough to call them inconsequential. The CPU score from 3DMark's TimeSpy test, however, is far more favourable to the DDR5 set from Corsair. This time, the DDR5 performance uplift versus fast and dual rank DDR4 kits is in the order of 5% or higher. That's particularly useful if you have an interest in benchmarking and obtaining higher scores. F1 2020 does not care much for the heaps of bandwidth offered up by high-speed DDR5. There is no major difference between most of the DDR4 kits and DDR5, though Kingston's premium spec Fury Renegade set does offer a measurable frame rate boost. Far Cry 6 defaults to the performance hierarchy we saw in a few other tests. Kingston's fast DDR4 sits above the G-Skill set, which in turn matches the Corsair DDR5 numbers. Once again, we see a game that doesn't really care all too much for the sizable bandwidth offered up by fast DDR5, and instead sees the latency as a bit of a downside. The Division 2 does seem to change that precedence a little. This time, Corsair's DDR5 takes second place on our chart, only being roughly matched by the high speed and tight latency Kingston DDR4 kit. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a game that we can always rely on for showing differences in memory performance. Corsair's DDR5 takes second spot on our chart and positions itself just below some very high-end DDR4 memory in terms of performance. The FPS boost versus even G-Skill's tight 3600 MHz DDR4 kit is measurable in favour of DDR5 here. And Watch Dogs Legion shows similar behaviour to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but this time DDR5 roughly matches the top spot in our chart. At a little over 100 FPS average, a performance uplift of a few FPS by opting for DDR5 is potentially worth it, especially to those with a high refresh rate monitor who want every last frame from their system. So there we have a few decent DDR4 kits and how they compare to a new premium set of DDR5 memory in a like-for-like testing scenario. I would say at this point the result is not conclusively in favour of the new memory technology, if I'm being perfectly honest. In general, the new DDR5 2x16GB 5200MHz kit does really well in spite of its latency, which is not very good, and the penalization from the Intel memory controller clock because of that gear ratio with this high memory frequency. Real-world performance in tests such as 7-zip or Handbrake are really good shows of strength for DDR5 because those tests love memory bandwidth and the frequency of DDR5 really does give you that. But in actual games, DDR5 is not really noticeably quicker than a premium set of DDR4 with something like 3600MHz frequency, that preferential memory controller clock on the Intel platform, decent timings, and something like Samsung B-die ICs. So yes, a premium set of DDR4, but this is a premium set of DDR5. And in games, it's not really noticeably quicker. But to be perfectly honest, I guess this is to be expected. New memory technologies always take a little bit of time to mature. And that's not to say anything negative really about the Corsair Dominator modules, which I must say I do like, and are premium modules. Just the fact of the matter with a new memory technology. We always see it. And one thing I can categorically say at this point is that the introduction of DDR5 to the consumer platform is leap years better than the introduction of DDR4 with the X99 platform was. So I think we have to really give some proper credit to Intel there, as well as the memory vendors and of course the motherboard partners. They've done a really stellar job to smoothen the experience with DDR5. I'm actually genuinely impressed and surprised, if I'm being perfectly honest. Clearly, DDR5 is the future, and only latency-sensitive applications should have you hesitating towards the choice if you go in Intel 12th Gen. And pricing, of course, as we've acknowledged a few times, because DDR5 is it's really expensive. With our premium Corsair Dominator 32GB 5200MHz set, it's around about £330 on Overclockers UK at the moment. That's not cheap. If we look at, say, a 3600MHz DDR4 kit of roughly equivalent specifications, so 3600MHz, C14, so pretty nice timings, Dominator Platinum RGB still, that's somewhere in the order of about £260. So the premium for DDR5 looks to be somewhere in the order of maybe £70 or so, which in isolation is quite a decent amount. In overall platform and system build cost is probably easy to be absorbed. But in terms of actual just pure memory cost, that's quite a decent chunk, to be honest. Then again, I think it's easy to argue that an extra £70 for a premium versus premium set of memory, which does deliver better performance in certain scenarios and then roughly equivalent performance in other scenarios, and perhaps slightly lesser performance in scenarios where the lower clocked DDR4 can keep that Gear 1 mode on the Intel platform. I think it can be argued that £70 is perhaps worth the premium at this point in time because DDR5, as I keep saying, the technology is fundamentally better under the hood. So if we close out then, I would say the DDR5 is an exciting new technology introduced on the consumer desktop market. Higher frequencies, better power management, ECC on board, a new improved XMP profile. These are all good things. Yes, the pricing is high, but if you're buying a new system at this point in time and can afford the cost upgrade to go with DDR5 versus DDR4, I think it makes absolute sense. It's justifiable and it's probably the logical move. With that said, if you already have a premium set of DDR4 that you're perfectly happy with and you just switch in platforms to Z690 and Intel 12th Gen, there's an argument to be made that buying a DDR4 motherboard like the Tough Gaming actually makes sense if you can keep that premium set of DDR4. I don't know, maybe that's a discussion we'll have to have in the comment section down below. Let us know what you would do in that scenario. So yeah, DDR5 does look to be an improvement over DDR4 in many respects, but it's not a night and day improvement in scenarios such as gaming and some other tests. Anything bandwidth related really is going to fly. Anything latency sensitive, perhaps not so much. I've been Luke Hill for Kicker. Thank you for watching this video analysis of DDR5 versus DDR4 on the new Intel 12th Gen platform. Hopefully we'll do some more testing like this in the near future to see how things mature with the DDR5 market and some more motherboard and Windows 11, etc, updates. If you like this video, give us a like and subscribe, hit the bell icon, do all that YouTube stuff, join the channel as a member, it really supports us. Please do check out the written review on the Kicker website, there's more information over there and that really does support us. If you want to help us out even more, you can buy a cool t-shirt like this, and make sure you check us out on Discord and Patreon and all the other ones where you can keep in touch with us. I'll see you in the next one.